Maya had chosen her seat with the precision of a chess master planning 7 moves ahead. Third row, fourth desk from the left, close enough to the window that she could lose herself in the clouds and trees outside, but far enough back that Mrs. eyes had to work a little harder to find her. It was the perfect intersection of visibility and invisibility, a position she'd claimed on the first day of 3rd grade and maintained religiously through September, October, and now into November. At 8 years old, Maya had already learned a skill that most adults spent lifetimes perfecting: the art of disappearing. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Riverside Elementary's 3rd grade classroom, casting golden rectangles across the worn wooden desks. Mrs. stood at the front, enthusiastically explaining fractions using drawings of pizza slices on the whiteboard. "If we cut this pizza into 8 pieces and you eat 2, how many are left?" she asked brightly, looking around the room. Hands shot up around Maya, eager hands belonging to kids who loved the sound of their own voices, who didn't understand that speaking in class was like standing naked in front of the entire world. Maya's hand remained folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on her notebook where she'd already written the correct answer: 6 pieces. She knew it instantly. She always knew the answers, but knowing and saying were entirely different universes, separated by a vast chasm of terror that she'd never been able to cross. "Maya," Mrs. called out, and Maya's stomach performed an elaborate somersault. This was the moment she'd been dreading since the math lesson started. The teacher's voice was kind. Mrs. was one of the good ones, never mean about it, but kindness made it worse somehow. Pity was harder to bear than cruelty. Maya felt 28 pairs of eyes swivel toward her desk. She could sense them, even without looking up. The weight of their attention was physical, pressing down on her chest like a hand squeezing her lungs. Her mouth opened slightly, and she pointed to her throat, then shook her head with an apologetic grimace. It was the same gesture she'd perfected over months, the same expression she wore like a mask. "Sorry, I'd love to help, but I have a sore throat." The lie had become so automatic that sometimes she almost believed it herself. Mrs. face softened with sympathy. "That's okay, sweetie, I hope you feel better soon." She turned to another student and the weight lifted as quickly as it had descended. Hands flew up again, voices called out answers, and Maya breathed. But the relief never lasted. It was always temporary, a brief reprieve before the next time. At home, the situation was entirely different. The family apartment buzzed with noise and life and voices. Her mother was a librarian who believed strongly in the power of words, and she'd filled their home with books and conversation. Her father, David, was a software engineer who came home from work eager to hear about everyone's day. Her younger brother, Tommy, was 5 and talked constantly, barely pausing to breathe between sentences. And grandmother, who lived with them, spent her evenings cooking and telling stories about her childhood in Taiwan, her voice warm and full of laughter. Maya chattered with all of them. She sang songs at the dinner table. She told jokes to Tommy that made him giggle until milk came out of his nose. She asked her mother elaborate questions about the books in the library. She discussed science projects with her father. She was animated, energetic, and completely, utterly verbal. The moment she walked through the doors of Riverside Elementary, she transformed. It had started in kindergarten, subtly at first. She'd always been a quieter child, more observant than talkative. But in 1st grade, something shifted. During a class presentation about families, the teacher had called on her to stand up and introduce herself. Maya remembered the feeling vividly, the room spinning, her vision narrowing, her heart hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape. She'd stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 seconds. The other kids had started to giggle. The teacher had gently sat her down, and something inside Maya had locked shut like a vault. By 2nd grade, it had become a pattern. By 3rd grade, it was her identity. Her parents had noticed, of course. How could they not? The contrast between home Maya and school Maya was stark and undeniable. Had taken her to their pediatrician first, who'd found nothing physically wrong. Then came the child psychologist doctor, who gently explained to and David that Maya had something called selective mutism, an anxiety disorder where children could speak perfectly well in comfortable settings, but became completely unable to speak in situations that triggered their anxiety. Usually it was social situations, performance situations, or situations where they felt observed. It's not stubbornness, Doctor had explained, his voice patient and kind. And it's not a willful choice. Her brain is essentially freezing up in response to anxiety. The fight or flight response is kicking in and her nervous system is choosing to freeze. She literally cannot speak, even though she wants to. The diagnosis had given the silence a name, but it hadn't made the silence any less lonely. Now, sitting at her desk in November, Maya watched the other kids interact with an anthropologist's fascination. Tommy's best friend called out answers with his hand raised so high his whole arm seemed to vibrate with excitement. Jessica, who sat 2 desks over, was already doodling on the margins of her worksheet, completely unconcerned about whether she spoke or not. And then there was, who always asked Mrs. questions, whose voice cut through the classroom with perfect clarity and confidence. What did they have that Maya didn't? How were they so fearless? She'd tried everything. She'd practiced speaking in front of her bathroom mirror at home, her voice steady and assured. She'd written down what she wanted to say before class and rehearsed it obsessively. She'd even tried breathing exercises that Doctor had taught her. None of it mattered. The moment she stepped into that classroom, her throat would tighten, her palms would sweat, and her voice would retreat into whatever dark corner of her mind it inhabited during school hours. The worst part wasn't the silence itself. It was what came with it. The pity in teachers' eyes, the confusion of classmates who didn't understand why she wouldn't talk, the slow realization that she was becoming invisible, that her silence was hardening into identity, that Silent Maya was becoming her permanent label. At recess, while other kids played tag and kickball, Maya usually sat on the bench near the playground's edge, watching. She'd bring a book to school, and she'd lose herself in stories of brave characters who said exactly what they needed to say when they needed to say it. She wondered what it felt like to move through the world with that kind of certainty, that kind of voice. She didn't know then that her story was about to change. She couldn't have guessed that in just a few weeks, her silence would finally be broken. Not by force, not by therapy, not by willpower, but by the unexpected grace of a dog with amber eyes and a police officer who understood that sometimes the most powerful connections happen without words. But that was still ahead of her. For now, Maya simply sat at her desk, 3rd row, 4th from the left, and waited for the school day to end. The note came home in Maya's backpack on a Tuesday afternoon, printed on bright yellow paper with a little rainbow border. Special gratitude assembly this Friday at 10 a.m. It announced in cheerful purple lettering. Students are invited to share what they're grateful for, a wonderful opportunity for self-expression and community building. Maya's mother read it aloud while making after-school snacks, her voice warm and encouraging. Oh, how nice! Maya, you could share something. Maybe you're grateful for grandmother's cooking, or Tommy's jokes. But Maya's heart had already begun its familiar descent into her stomach. A special assembly, gratitude sharing, self-expression. Every word was a small hammer strike against her anxiety. She'd known this day would come eventually. Assemblies were part of school life, as inevitable as lunch and recess. But knowing something intellectually and feeling prepared for it were entirely different things. I'll think about it, she'd said quietly, which her mother interpreted as interest rather than absolute dread. For 3 days, Maya carried the weight of that yellow paper like a stone in her backpack. She lay awake at night, imagining scenarios. What if Mrs. called on her? What if she was expected to volunteer? What if she froze again like she had during the pizza fraction presentation, and this time there would be hundreds of people watching instead of just one classroom? By Thursday night, she couldn't eat her dinner. Grandmother noticed and pressed a hand to her forehead. Are you sick, little one? Just tired, Maya whispered. But she wasn't tired, she was terrified. Friday morning arrived with the inevitability of sunrise. Maya put on her favorite purple sweater, the one that made her feel a little braver, and she tried to convince herself that everything would be fine. She could sit in the back. She could stay silent. The assembly would happen, she wouldn't say anything, and it would be over. Simple. Safe. The gymnasium smelled like old wood and floor polish, and the indefinable scent of concentrated childhood. A mixture of peanut butter sandwiches, playground dirt, and marker fumes. Rows of folding chairs had been set up in careful lines, and children from all grades were filing in, filling the space with an excited buzz of energy. Third graders, fourth graders, fifth graders, all the way up to fifth graders, plus their teachers and parents who'd been invited. Mrs. had gently guided Maya's hand as they filed in with the other third graders, and Maya had made her way to a back row seat exactly as she'd planned. The chair was uncomfortable, plastic and cold against the backs of her thighs, but it was positioned perfectly for invisibility. She could sink low, make herself small, and most importantly, she was far from the stage and the microphone. The gymnasium was packed. Maya counted at least 300 people, maybe more. The noise was overwhelming, the scraping of chairs, the babble of hundreds of voices, the echoing announcements from teachers trying to get students to settle down. The acoustics made everything louder, more intense, more chaotic. Principal took the microphone and his voice boomed through the speakers. "Good morning, everyone. We're so glad you're here for our special gratitude assembly. Today, we're celebrating all the things we're thankful for in our lives. Thank you to our PTA for organizing this wonderful event." Everyone applauded. Maya clapped along, trying to disappear into her seat. "We've invited some of our wonderful students to share what they're grateful for," Principal continued. "This is a beautiful opportunity for all of you to practice public speaking and to celebrate the positive things in your lives. We'll have some wonderful shares, and I hope you'll all be inspired." Maya's stomach twisted into a pretzel shape. Public speaking. That phrase floated in the air like a threat. Several students went first. A confident fourth grader named James talked about being grateful for his soccer team. A shy fifth grader stumbled through a speech about her grandmother. A funny second grader named made the whole audience laugh by saying he was grateful for pizza and video games. Each time, Principal clapped enthusiastically and encouraged the audience to do the same. Maya kept her head down, her fingers interlaced tightly in her lap. Then Principal said, "I'd like to invite up our wonderful third grade class. Mrs., would you like to send up one of your students?" Mrs. stood up in the third grade section, and her eyes scanned the rows. Maya suddenly understood what was about to happen, and every cell in her body went rigid with panic. "No, please, no. Why don't we have Maya come up and share?" Mrs. said brightly, her voice full of encouragement and good intentions. "Maya's a wonderful student, and I think she'd have something beautiful to share." The world shifted, time distorted, everything slowed down and sped up simultaneously. Mrs. was looking at her. Principal was looking at her. 300 pairs of eyes were suddenly focused on one small 8-year-old girl in a purple sweater. "Come on up, Maya," Principal said warmly. Her body moved against her conscious will. Her legs stood up. Her feet carried her toward the stage, and she felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, like she was floating above herself, observing this catastrophe unfold in real time. She climbed the 3 steps to the stage. The microphone seemed to grow larger as she approached it. Principal handed it to her, and her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold it. "Tell us what you're grateful for, Maya," he said gently. Her mouth opened. She could see it happening like watching a movie. Her jaw dropped, but no sound came out, nothing, just air. The gymnasium fell silent, waiting. She tried again. Her throat had closed completely, sealed shut by her own anxiety. She opened her mouth wider and still nothing emerged. And then from the back of the gymnasium, someone giggled. Once the first laugh started, it was like a dam breaking. What had been sympathy or confusion transformed instantly into amusement. A few snickers became a dozen became dozens. Soon the entire gymnasium was filled with laughter, some covering their mouths, some not bothering to hide it. Heat flooded Maya's face, her vision blurred with tears. She could see Principal's expression shift from encouraging to concerned. Mrs. looked stricken, and the laughter continued, rolling through the gymnasium like a wave. Maya couldn't remember how she got off the stage. One moment she was standing there in front of the world, completely exposed and utterly helpless. The next moment she was back in her seat, her chest heaving, tears streaming silently down her face. Mrs. was nearby, patting her shoulder, whispering apologies and reassurances that nobody could hear over the laughter and the shuffle of the assembly continuing. The rest of the assembly passed in a blur of humiliation. By Monday morning, Maya was silent Maya not just among her classmates, but in her own mind. The kids who'd laughed called her the robot girl who couldn't talk. Some, emboldened by the assembly's response, would walk past her desk and make exaggerated opening and closing motions with their hands, pretending to be a malfunctioning puppet. At home, her mother held her while she cried, and her own eyes filled with tears of frustration and helplessness. Doctor increased her therapy sessions to twice a week. Her father suggested that maybe medication might help. Her grandmother made her favorite foods, trying to tempt her to eat. But nothing could erase the feeling of those 300 eyes on her. Nothing could silence the echoing laughter in her head. Nothing could convince her that speaking in school was anything other than the most terrifying, humiliating, impossible thing in the world. The assembly had been meant to celebrate gratitude and connection. Instead, it had become the moment that locked Maya's silence even more firmly in place, the moment that transformed her private struggle into public spectacle, the moment that changed everything. Though not in the way anyone could have predicted, 3 weeks after the assembly, Maya had developed a precise routine for getting through each school day without additional humiliation. She arrived just as the final bell rang, claimed her seat in the 3rd row, and kept her eyes firmly fixed on her desk or the window. During group discussions, she became invisible. During transitions, she moved with the efficiency of a shadow, making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. She'd perfected the art of survival through absolute anonymity. The silent Maya jokes had died down somewhat, replaced by simple indifference. Most of her classmates had moved on to other dramas and entertainments, but that indifference, somehow, felt worse than the laughter. At least laughter meant they noticed her. Indifference meant she'd become irrelevant, a fixture of the classroom landscape that everyone had learned to ignore. She ate lunch alone, always in the same corner of the cafeteria, with a book propped in front of her face. She read constantly, books about animals, adventure stories, anything that could transport her to a place where she wasn't afraid. Her mother had gotten her a library card with privileges for the adult section, and Maya spent hours lost in nature documentaries and memoirs and fantasy worlds where brave heroes didn't freeze when people looked at them. It was on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. made the announcement. "Class, I have some exciting news. This Friday, we're going to have special visitors from the police department. Officer James and his K-9 partner, Legend, are coming to talk to us about community service and police work. This is a wonderful opportunity to learn about helping our community." The classroom buzzed with interest. Most of the kids seemed excited. Police dogs were cool, after all. Raised his hand and asked if Legend could do tricks. Jessica wanted to know if he could bite bad guys. Even the usually quiet smiled at the prospect. Maya's reaction was more complicated. An assembly meant being back in the gymnasium where the laughter had happened. It meant crowds and noise and exposure. But there was something about the description of the dog that pulled at her attention. She loved animals, always had. At home, she spent hours watching nature documentaries, reading books about animal behavior and sketching pictures of different species. There was something about animals that felt safer than people. They didn't judge, didn't expect performance, didn't require the exhausting social calculus that came with human interaction. A dog named Legend. She didn't know why, but that name intrigued her. Thursday night, Maya couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the apartment, her brother's occasional murmur from the bed across the room, the hum of the refrigerator, her parents' voices in low conversation in the living room. Her mind raced with contradictions. Part of her wanted to fake sick and stay home. Part of her wanted to see this dog. Both impulses felt equally valid and equally terrifying. She thought about telling her mother, but had already been so worried since the assembly. There were dark circles under her eyes. She kept asking if Maya wanted to continue with doctor's therapy or try medication. Maya didn't want to add another layer of anxiety to her mother's burden. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, November asserting its seasonal dominance. Maya dressed in her purple sweater again, the brave one, though she wasn't sure bravery came from clothing. She picked at her breakfast while grandmother fussed over her, concerned about her quiet demeanor. "You have a special day today, yes?" grandmother asked in her accented English. "The dog comes to school." Maya nodded. She hadn't realized anyone was listening when the announcement was made, but grandmother heard everything. "Dogs are good for the soul," grandmother said wisely, setting down a plate of steamed buns in front of her. "They know how to love without complications. Maybe this dog, he will be good for you." The gymnasium had been transformed again, but this time with less ceremony than the gratitude assembly. Bleachers had been set up in a semicircle, and there were some printed posters about police safety and community service taped to the walls. The energy felt different too, more casual, less high stakes. There wasn't the weight of performance that had hung over the gratitude assembly. Mrs. had positioned the third grade in the bleachers, and Maya managed to secure a spot in the back row again, her preferred geography of invisibility. She sat down and immediately focused on the front of the gymnasium, watching the doors through which the officer and dog would enter. Around her, her classmates chattered excitedly, was telling about a dog he'd seen on YouTube that could catch frisbees from 30 feet away. Jessica was speculating about whether the police dog would be scary, was asking Mrs. questions about what K9 meant and whether it was an acronym. Maya said nothing as always, but her attention was sharp and focused. At exactly 10 a.m., the gymnasium doors opened. Officer James entered first, a tall man in a dark blue police uniform, his presence commanding but not intimidating. He carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to managing situations and people. Behind him walked the dog. And what a dog it was! Legend was a German shepherd of impressive proportions, his coat a perfect blend of black and tan and rich brown, like autumn leaves mixed with chocolate. His movements were fluid and purposeful, each step deliberate and measured. But what caught Maya's attention most were his eyes, intelligent amber eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with acute awareness. He wasn't merely walking into a gymnasium. He was assessing it, understanding it, processing the energy and the crowd with the wisdom of a being far older than his years. The gymnasium fell silent, as if by collective agreement. Everyone felt it. The presence of something extraordinary had just entered the room. "Good morning, everyone," officer said into the microphone, his voice warm and welcoming. "I'm Officer James, and this is my partner, Legend. Legend is a German shepherd who works with our police department in various capacities. Today, I thought we'd show you some of what he can do and talk about what it means to be part of our community." Legend sat beside the officer, perfectly poised, his attention on but also somehow aware of the crowd. He didn't seem nervous or anxious. He simply was present, calm, accepting. Over the next 30 minutes, Officer demonstrated Legend's training. The dog retrieved objects, responded to commands instantly, navigated obstacles, and demonstrated the precise discipline that years of training had instilled. But what was most remarkable wasn't his obedience. it was his demeanor. Legend seemed to enjoy the work, seemed to understand that he was performing a service, seemed perfectly content to be exactly what his training had made him. But it was what happened near the end of the demonstration that changed everything for Maya. Officer explained that Legend also worked in a capacity beyond traditional police work. Legend is trained not just to perform police functions, he said, but to provide comfort and support to people who are experiencing trauma or anxiety. He can sense when someone needs connection, and he has an intuition about helping in those moments. Police and military dogs like Legend often become lifelines for people who are struggling. Maya felt something shift inside her chest. A lifeline, a dog that could sense when someone needed help, a being that could provide comfort without judgment or expectation. She found herself standing without consciously deciding to do so. All around her, kids were standing too, preparing to file out of the gymnasium. The assembly was ending. The dog would leave, and that would be that. But then Legend's eyes found hers across the gymnasium. Intelligent, warm, amber eyes. And for just a moment, Maya felt seen. Truly, completely seen in a way that didn't require words or performance or any of the terrible machinery of social anxiety. That single look, lasting just a few seconds, was enough to make her believe that her story was about to change. Maya didn't consciously make the decision to linger. Her body simply refused to move with the rest of her classmates as they filed out of the gymnasium toward the doors. Mrs. was busy helping organize the other kids, checking that everyone was accounted for, and in the resulting chaos of transition, Maya found herself standing alone in the gradually emptying bleachers. Officer was beginning to pack up his materials, a collection of equipment, treats, and training aids that he carefully placed into a large duffel bag. Legend stood beside him, alert but relaxed, his tongue lolling slightly from the exertion of the demonstration. The gymnasium had transformed from a cacophony of childhood noise to something almost peaceful, the echoes of excited voices fatting down the hallway. Maya was acutely aware that she should leave. That staying was unusual, possibly noteworthy, possibly opening herself to questions she couldn't answer. But something stronger than her habitual caution held her in place. It was the same pull she felt toward the ocean in nature documentaries, toward the music in songs, toward the characters in books who faced their fears and survived. She pretended to retie her shoe, a gesture she'd perfected over months of needing inconspicuous reasons to be places. She crouched down, her fingers fumbling with already secure shoelaces, watching Officer and Legend from beneath her veil of hair. That's when the officer looked up and noticed her. Their eyes met, her anxious brown eyes and his kind hazel ones, and for a moment nothing moved except her heart, which accelerated like it was trying to escape her body. She expected him to smile in that pitying way adults did when they knew about her silence, that particular blend of sympathy and concern that made her feel even more broken. But he didn't. Instead, Officer simply nodded, as if he recognized her from the gymnasium but also recognized something else, something about the way she lingered, about the way she was watching, about the hunger in her attention. "You want to say hello to Legend?" he asked casually, as if this were the most natural question in the world. Not "do you want to pet the dog?" or "would you like to meet Legend?" but specifically "say hello," as if he understood that for her, greeting might be a process, a negotiation between what she wanted and what her anxiety allowed. Maya's head moved in an emphatic nod. She couldn't make her mouth work, couldn't force words past the familiar constriction in her throat, but her body's response was unambiguous. Officer smiled, a genuine smile, not the practiced customer service smile of someone performing friendliness, but a real expression of warmth, and settled himself onto the gymnasium floor, crossing his legs in a posture that was deliberately non-threatening, deliberately humble. By sitting down, he'd lowered himself to closer to Maya's eye level, had made himself smaller and less imposing. "Come sit with us," he said, gesturing to the space beside him. Maya descended from the bleachers carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled. Her purple sneakers felt heavy on the polished gymnasium floor. She crossed the space between them, and each step felt like a small act of courage. When she reached Officer, she sat down carefully, her body held rigid, her breath shallow. She could feel her anxiety like a physical thing, a tight band around her chest, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. Officer didn't immediately draw attention to her presence. Instead, he turned to Legend and began running his fingers through the dog's thick coat in long, slow strokes. "You did great work today, boy," he said softly, his voice warm and conversational. "All those people, and you stayed so focused, so calm. That's the mark of a true professional." He continued speaking, not to Maya, but to Legend, his words painting a narrative of the dog's character and accomplishments. "I think Legend was probably a little tired, though. All that demonstrating, all those people watching. That can be a lot, even for a dog as well trained as you are. Sometimes the best part of the day is just sitting quietly afterward, isn't it? Just being here, not performing, just existing." It was this last part that caught Maya's attention, not performing, not being watched or judged, just existing. The words struck something deep inside her. As if sensing her attention, Legend turned his head and looked directly at her. His amber eyes were warm and intelligent, and there was no evaluation in that gaze, no demand for performance or speech or response. He simply looked at her, and then, with the gentle deliberation of a creature accustomed to moving carefully around humans, he stepped forward and rested his massive head directly on her lap. The weight of that head, solid and warm and real, was everything. It was anchor and permission and acceptance all at once. Maya felt tears spill suddenly from her eyes, running down her cheeks in silent streams. But these weren't tears of fear or anxiety or the humiliation she'd carried since the assembly. These were tears of relief, of recognition, of finally being seen by a being that asked nothing of her except that she exist. "Legend's very good at knowing when someone needs a friend," Officer said gently, not looking directly at her, not making the moment about observation or evaluation. He kept his eyes on the dog, kept his attention seemingly focused elsewhere, creating a protective bubble of privacy around Maya's emotional response. "He has an instinct for it, a sensitivity. Some dogs are like that. They understand things about people that people themselves don't always understand." Maya's trembling hands, almost of their own accord, reached out and touched the soft fur of Legend's head. Her fingers sank into his coat, finding the warm skin beneath. The sensation was grounding, real, tangible in a way that nothing had been since the assembly destroyed her sense of safety. They sat like that for what might have been 5 minutes or might have been 20. Time felt fluid and untrustworthy. Officer continued speaking softly, occasionally to Legend, occasionally in a more general way that didn't require response. "Sometimes people think that being good at something means always performing," he said thoughtfully. "But that's not true. Being good at something means understanding when to perform and when to rest. It means knowing your own value isn't dependent on what anyone else thinks. Legend knows that. He knows he's valuable, and he doesn't need applause to understand it." Maya's breath gradually slowed. Her hands continued to stroke Legend's fur, finding a rhythm that was calming for both of them. She didn't know when she started breathing normally again, but at some point her chest loosened enough that she could take deeper breaths. Officer eventually shifted slightly. "I think Legend would like to come back and visit your school again," he said, still not making direct eye contact, still respecting the fragile equilibrium they'd created. "If that would be okay with you, I mean if you'd like that. He seems to like it here." Maya looked at the officer, and her eyes met his for just a moment before she nodded. She couldn't speak, but her nod was clear and certain. Officer smiled. "Good. Then I'll arrange it with Principal. Legend will be back." He paused, then added quietly, "You know, sometimes the most important conversations happen without any words at all. Sometimes a presence is enough. Sometimes a friendship starts with a dog putting his head on your lap and understanding exactly what you need. As if to punctuate his point, Legend shifted his position slightly, pressing himself more firmly against Maya's legs, a gesture of connection and acceptance that needed no translation. That day in that quiet gymnasium after everyone else had left, something inside Maya began to shift. Not a cure, not a quick fix, but a beginning. A tiny crack in the wall of her anxiety, barely visible but real nonetheless. She still didn't speak, but for the first time since the assembly, she didn't feel completely alone in her silence. Officer kept his promise. The following Friday, he arrived at Riverside Elementary with Legend, and though the full school assembly happened as scheduled afterward, he found Maya waiting by the library entrance, her small frame leaning against the doorframe with barely concealed anticipation. "I thought you might be here," he said warmly, and Legend's tail began wagging immediately upon seeing her, as if the dog had remembered their connection from the previous week. Perhaps he had. Maya was beginning to understand that dogs possessed wisdom about the world that humans often overlooked. This routine continued, week after week. Every Friday afternoon, after the school assembly or demonstration, Officer would make his way to a quiet corner of the school, sometimes the library, sometimes the empty cafeteria, sometimes just a hallway corner where they could exist without intrusion. And Maya would be there waiting, her anxiety still present but increasingly manageable in the presence of this calm man and his extraordinary dog. The first 2 weeks were wordless. They simply existed together, Maya, Officer, and Legend in companionable silence. The officer never pushed conversation. He seemed to understand that for Maya, silence wasn't a void that needed filling, but rather a necessary part of her healing. He would talk to Legend, narrating the dog's imaginary thoughts in a voice touched with humor and warmth. "Legend thinks the library is an excellent choice today," he might say. "He's very fond of the smell of old books. It reminds him of wisdom and adventure. He's wondering what you're reading." He gestured toward the book in her lap. This week it was a biography of Jane, the primatologist who'd lived among chimpanzees and changed the way humans understood animals. "Ah, Jane," Officer continued, nodding appreciatively at the cover. "An excellent choice. Legend says Jane understood something very important about connection. She understood that patience and presence are more powerful than demands and performance. She didn't try to make the chimpanzees talk or behave in ways that made humans comfortable. She simply showed up, paid attention, and let connection develop naturally." Maya would listen to these observations, and something in the officer's words seemed to speak directly to her condition. He was describing her own struggle, the difference between authentic connection and forced performance, without ever directly calling attention to her silence. By the 3rd week, something shifted. They were sitting in the cafeteria, which had been emptied after lunch. Legend had discovered a fascinating spot beneath one of the tables and was investigating it with the seriousness of a detective at a crime scene. Officer was describing a call he'd responded to that morning, a lost cat stuck in a storm drain, with the kind of narrative flair that made it sound like an adventure novel. "The cat was terrified," he was saying, "frozen in fear, just like Legend sometimes freezes when he encounters something unfamiliar before his training kicks in. But here's the interesting part. Once the cat realized I wasn't a threat, that I was simply there to help, it changed everything. The cat came out of that drain willingly. Fear loses power when we realize we're not alone in it." Maya felt something shift in her chest. She thought about the assembly, about the laughter, about the weight of 300 eyes on her. She thought about how that moment had frozen her even further into silence, had made her believe that speaking would always result in humiliation. But sitting here with Officer and Legend, she didn't feel humiliated. She felt safe. Week 4 arrived with a moment that would become the turning point. They were in the library, their favorite spot, and Legend's leash had become tangled around one of the wooden chair legs. The dog had been moving around the small area where they usually sat, sniffing at books, and generally being his curious self. And somehow the leash had wrapped itself into an elaborate knot. Legend looked at Officer with an expression of mild confusion, clearly wondering why his mobility had been suddenly restricted. Officer chuckled, preparing to untangle the mess himself, but Maya's body responded before her mind could catch up. She moved forward and her mouth opened, and from somewhere deep inside, from that place where her voice had been hiding, came 3 words. "Let me help." The words were barely audible, whispered rather than spoken, fragile as cobwebs, but they existed. They were real. They hung in the air between them like precious things. Officer froze for just a moment, and Maya could see him making a conscious choice not to make a big deal about what had just happened. His expression didn't shift into shock or congratulation. Instead, he simply nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he said, as if she just offered him a pencil or pointed out the right aisle. "That's very kind of you." Maya's trembling hands worked at the leash, carefully unwrapping the tangled length from around the chair leg. Her heart was racing, but this time not from anxiety, from something else, something like hope, something like the first tentative belief that maybe her voice didn't have to be permanently locked away. The following week, she managed a full sentence, though it took her several minutes to force the words out. "Legend's fur is soft today." Officer responded as if she'd just given a lengthy speech. "You're right. I gave him a bath yesterday. He loves water, did you know that? It's unusual for German shepherds. Many of them are hesitant about water, but Legend embraces it fully. I think he understands that sometimes we need to be cleaned, refreshed, prepared to start again." Week 6 brought 2 sentences. Week 7 brought a question. Does he like the library better than the cafeteria? Officer considered this seriously, as if it were a profound philosophical inquiry. "I think he likes wherever you are," he said simply. "The location is secondary to the connection. Legend understands something that takes most humans years to figure out. That presence is the greatest gift we can offer another being." By week 8, Maya found herself having quiet conversations. They were still halting, still requiring effort, still emerging from her throat like swimmers pushing against water. But they were conversations. Real back-and-forth exchanges about Legend's training, about police work, about animals and behavior, and the things that interested her. She asked about how Legend became a therapy dog. Officer explained the training process, the personality traits that made a dog suited for this work, the way trauma and anxiety could be sensed by sensitive animals, and how their calm presence could provide a bridge back to safety. Legend was chosen for this work because he possesses something rare, Officer explained. It's not just training or obedience, though he has plenty of both. It's an innate empathy, a genuine desire to help, and the ability to remain calm in the presence of other people's fear. Those qualities can't be taught. They're either present in a creature or they're not. As he spoke, Legend pressed his head against Maya's leg, and she realized he was demonstrating exactly what the officer was describing. The dog's presence was therapeutic in and of itself, requiring nothing from her except that she exist in it. By the 8th Friday, as Officer prepared to leave, he paused and said something that would echo in Maya's mind for years to come. "You know, the most important thing I've learned in my work is that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite the fear. You've been doing that every single week, and Legend and I have noticed. We're proud of you." Maya didn't respond with words. Her voice still wasn't capable of that kind of vulnerability, but her eyes filled with tears, and she wrapped her arms around Legend's neck. And in that embrace, something fundamental shifted. The girl who'd been frozen on that gymnasium stage, the girl who'd been labeled Silent Maya, was beginning to believe that she might, after all, have a voice worth hearing. News travels through elementary schools with the speed and efficiency of wildfire through dry grass. Children are natural observers and reporters, noticing every shift in the social landscape, every deviation from established patterns. By the 3rd week of Officer's visits, whispers had begun circulating through the hallways of Riverside Elementary. Silent Maya was talking. Not a lot, not loudly, but talking nonetheless. The transformation was subtle enough that adults might have missed it, but children saw everything. It started with a simple observation from the confident kid who loved soccer and always raised his hand in class. He'd noticed Maya actually contributing to a small group discussion in Mrs. class, her voice barely above a whisper, her words chosen carefully, but unmistakably present. He'd mentioned it to his friend, who'd mentioned it to Jessica, and by Friday, the entire third grade had become aware that something fundamental had shifted with the quiet girl in the back row. But what nobody expected was the domino effect that would follow. A week after his observation, a pale, serious-faced girl with perpetually anxious eyes approached Mrs. during lunch. Was the kind of student who always knew the right answers but never raised her hand, who turned in beautifully completed assignments but looked physically ill whenever called upon to present them. "Mrs.," she'd said quietly, her voice trembling, "I was wondering, could I maybe talk to you about something?" Over the course of that conversation, revealed something she'd been carrying alone for 2 years. She couldn't speak during class presentations. She knew the material. She understood everything perfectly. But when she stood in front of the class, her mind went blank, her throat closed, and she became completely unable to function. She'd been managing by working incredibly hard on written assignments, and hopping the oral components of grades would somehow be overlooked. Mrs. listened with growing understanding. "Have you noticed what's happened with Maya?" she asked gently. Nodded. She couldn't talk either, and now she can, at least a little. How did she do that? When Mrs. explained about Officer and Legend, about the weekly visits and the safe space that had been created, his eyes filled with tears of recognition. This was her, exactly. She wasn't broken or stubborn or lazy. She was afraid. The conversation led to another, which led to another. Within 2 weeks, Mrs. had identified 3 other students in the 3rd grade alone who were struggling with similar anxiety-based speaking difficulties. There was the funny kid who made everyone laugh, but who'd never voluntarily raised his hand, and whose parents had complained that he seemed to have performance anxiety. There was who was articulate and intelligent but who refused to participate in group projects because he couldn't handle the pressure of presenting. And there was a 4th grader named his younger brother, who'd started having stomachaches every time his teachers asked him to read aloud. What Mrs. did next was revolutionary for a school system that had traditionally viewed such difficulties as individual problems requiring individual solutions. She brought the situation to the staff meeting and presented it not as a series of isolated cases, but as a pattern that suggested something systemic needed to change. "These children aren't lazy or willfully refusing to participate," Mrs. explained to her colleagues, her passion evident in every word. "They're experiencing genuine anxiety that's beyond their control, and we've been responding by trying to force them to perform, which only increases their anxiety. We need a different approach." Principal listened carefully, and something in his expression suggested he was thinking not just about these individual students, but about the broader implications. "What kind of approach did you have in mind?" he asked. "I'd like to start a support group," Mrs. said. "A small, safe space where students who struggle with speaking anxiety can practice communication in a low-pressure environment. We could call it Quiet Voices or something similar. The goal wouldn't be to cure them immediately, but to help them understand that their fear is shared, that they're not alone, and that progress is possible." The proposal was approved, and by the following week, Quiet Voices had been established. It met twice a week in the library, facilitated by Mrs. and guided by a simple principle. There was no pressure to speak, but every attempt at communication was celebrated. The first meeting was attended by 5 students, Maya, and they sat in a circle in the library, surrounded by books and the comforting smell of paper and binding glue. There was an awkwardness at first, a hesitant quality to the room as each student assessed whether they could trust these strangers with their vulnerability. It was Maya who broke the ice, not through words but through gesture. She'd brought a drawing she'd made of Legend, a remarkably detailed sketch that captured the dog's intelligence and gentleness. She passed it around silently, and as each person looked at the drawing, something shifted. The picture became a conversation starter, a safe entry point into dialogue. "That's really good," said quietly, and the conversation began. Over the following weeks, the impact of quiet voices extended far beyond the library. Parents of the participating students began communicating with each other, sharing strategies and concerns. One mother's parent suggested bringing in a professional. That suggestion led to principal contacting Dr. Monroe, a child psychologist who specialized in anxiety disorders and selective mutism. Dr. Monroe arrived at Riverside Elementary on a cold December afternoon, and her presence transformed the school's understanding of what the students were experiencing. She delivered a presentation to the faculty about selective mutism and anxiety-based communication difficulties, explaining the neurobiology behind why these children's bodies seemed to betray them when they tried to speak in certain situations. "It's not a choice," Dr. Monroe explained, using a presentation that included brain scans and research data. The amygdala, the part of the brain that processes fear, is essentially hijacking their ability to speak. They're not being stubborn or dramatic. They're experiencing a neurological response to perceived threat. Understanding this allows us to respond with compassion instead of frustration. The presentation changed everything. Teachers began implementing accommodations not out of obligation, but out of genuine understanding. Group presentations became optional or could be done with small audiences. Students were given choices about how to demonstrate knowledge. Low-pressure practice opportunities were incorporated into daily instruction. But perhaps most importantly, the shame dissolved. Maya noticed it first. Kids stopped calling her Silent Maya, not because they were forced to, but because they understood now that her silence wasn't a defect. It was a response to anxiety. That understanding created space for her to be seen as a complete person, not defined by her difficulty. Started raising her hand during class, and when her voice came out shaky, nobody laughed. Discovered he could present to just the teacher and a few friends, and that small accommodation made the difference between complete shutdown and functional participation. Joined the drama club and found that performing fictional characters felt different from sharing his authentic self. The ripple effects extended into the families of these students. Smother started a parent support group for families dealing with selective mutism and anxiety disorders. They met monthly, sharing strategies, research, and encouragement. Parents who'd felt alone in their struggles discovered they weren't isolated. There were others on the same difficult journey. By December, Officer was no longer the only one facilitating therapeutic connections. The school had partnered with a local animal therapy organization to bring in additional certified therapy animals. A gentle rabbit visited the kindergarten classroom. A calm cat spent afternoons in the special education room. The benefits rippled through the entire school community. What had started as one girl's struggle, supported by one compassionate officer and one therapeutic dog, had become a school-wide transformation in how anxiety was understood and accommodated. The foundation was being laid not just for Maya's recovery, but for systemic change that would benefit countless students in the years to come. And it had all started with a girl who couldn't speak, a dog with amber eyes, and a community willing to respond with understanding instead of judgment. The summer between 3rd and 6th grade felt different to Maya. Not just because of the physical changes. She'd grown 3 inches, and her voice had developed new registers, but because of something internal, something fundamental that had shifted in her understanding of herself. She spent the summer volunteering at Riverside Animal Shelter, a decision that had emerged naturally from her growing passion for animal-assisted therapy and her desire to spend as much time as possible in environments where she felt safe. Officer had helped arrange the volunteer position. He knew the shelter director, and when he'd mentioned Maya's interest in animal behavior and therapy work, doors had opened. 3 mornings a week, Maya would arrive at the shelter with her mother, and she'd spend hours cleaning enclosures, feeding animals, and learning the intricate dance of animal care. But more importantly, she was speaking, constantly, to the shelter staff, to visiting volunteers, even to the animals themselves. The shelter director, Ms. No Relation, though they joked about it, had initially seemed surprised by Maya's quiet demeanor. But over the course of a few weeks, she'd realized that the quietness wasn't the same as the silence that had defined Maya's school experience. This was a different kind of quiet, the quiet of someone who was thoughtful, observant, and selective about her words, rather than incapable of producing them. "You have a gift with the animals," Ms. had told her one afternoon in August, as Maya worked with a shy rescue dog named Pepper who'd had a difficult past. "I can see them responding to your calm presence. You understand something about fear and anxiety that a lot of people never learn." By the time 6th grade arrived in September, Maya had internalized something crucial. Her anxiety didn't have to define her life. It was still there. She still felt nervous before presentations, still experienced butterflies before social situations. But she'd learned to move through life alongside her anxiety rather than being paralyzed by it. Her first day of middle school was deliberately chosen to be a day without officer's visit. Maya wanted to prove to herself that she could navigate new situations independently now, that Legend and Officer had been catalysts for change but not permanent crutches. She walked through the doors of Riverside Middle School with her mother that morning, and while her heart raced at the newness and the crowds, she didn't feel frozen. The physical layout of middle school was overwhelming: multiple teachers, multiple classrooms, hallways swarming with teenagers. But Maya had learned coping strategies. She found quiet corners during passing periods. She sat with a book during lunch. She participated in class, her voice small but present, and gradually she began to build connections. Had also transitioned to middle school, as had Anne. But beyond that familiar trio, Maya discovered new friends. There was a girl named Jasmine in her English class who also loved animals and spent lunch periods reading about wildlife. There was a boy named Alex in her science class who was working on a project about animal behavior and immediately wanted Maya's input. These friendships didn't happen through forced social situations, but through the natural convergence of shared interests. By October, Ms., now a 6th grade teacher, had recommended that Maya participate in the school's talent show. Not as a performer necessarily, Mrs. had clarified, understanding Maya's relationship with public performance, but maybe as part of a group, you could do something with Anne. The 3 of them had brainstormed together during lunch, and the idea had emerged organically, a comedy sketch about their experiences with anxiety, performed with exaggerated movements and funny dialogue. It was meta. They were literally performing about the fear of performance, and there was something liberating about that. They weren't pretending to be confident heroes. They were being honest about their struggles. The week before the talent show, Maya's anxiety spiked. The old fears returned, the memory of the assembly, of the laughter, of 300 eyes on her. She met with Officer and Legend before school one morning, seeking the grounding presence that had saved her before. "I'm scared," she told him, the words now coming easily even as they carried weight. "What if people laugh like they did before?" Officer sat down beside her, Legend immediately settling his head on her lap. "They might laugh," he said honestly, "but this time you'll be making them laugh on purpose. That's a completely different experience. You'll be in control of the narrative instead of being subject to it." The talent show arrived on a Friday evening. The auditorium was filled with students, parents, teachers, hundreds of people. Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the quickening of her pulse. But this time she had on one side and on the other, and they were all nervous together. Their sketch was 15 minutes of pure authenticity mixed with exaggerated humor, played an overly anxious student frozen at a presentation podium, played a concerned teacher trying increasingly ridiculous motivational tactics, and Maya played a narrator who periodically broke the fourth wall to comment on the absurdity of anxiety. The audience laughed, a lot, but they were laughing with the performers, celebrating their honesty and humor rather than mocking their vulnerability. When they took their bow, the applause was thunderous. Maya's eyes filled with tears, happy tears, proud tears, tears of recognition that she'd survived something that had once seemed impossible. As the school year progressed, Maya's confidence continued to build. She joined the school's environmental club and found herself naturally taking on a leadership role because of her animal knowledge. She started a petition to implement a school composting program, speaking at a school board meeting about environmental sustainability. The girl who couldn't speak in a classroom 6 months earlier was now presenting to adults in positions of authority. More importantly, she discovered her life's direction. By the end of 6th grade, she'd made a definitive decision. She wanted to pursue animal-assisted therapy professionally. She'd spent countless hours researching programs, reading about the science of how animals helped humans heal, learning about the different certifications and career paths available. She'd created a detailed notebook, color-coded and meticulously organized in a way that reflected her personality, outlining everything from the training requirements for therapy dogs to the graduate programs that specialized in this field. She'd interviewed Officer extensively about his work and had attended several workshops on trauma-informed care and animal behavior. Her mother found her one evening researching universities on her laptop, and tears had filled her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she'd said, embracing her daughter. "Not just for what you're doing, but for how far you've come. From silent Maya to this, it's extraordinary." The transformation was visible to everyone around her. Teachers who'd once looked at her with concern now looked at her with respect. Her classmates had stopped seeing her as the quiet girl and started seeing her as Maya, the one who knew everything about animals, who was funny and thoughtful, who had overcome something genuinely difficult. And Maya herself had internalized the most important lesson, that her voice was valuable, that her struggles had given her insights others didn't possess, and that being different wasn't a deficiency, it was a strength. She still got nervous. She still experienced anxiety in new social situations. The selective mutism hadn't completely disappeared. It had simply become manageable, transformed from a prison into a personality trait she'd learned to navigate. But the girl who'd been frozen on that assembly stage was gone, replaced by someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite it. And she owed it all to a dog with amber eyes, a compassionate police officer, and the grace of people who'd chosen understanding over judgment. 5 years after that fateful assembly, where 300 people had laughed at her silence, Maya stood backstage in the Riverside Elementary Gymnasium, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her note cards. She was no longer 8 years old, no longer in 3rd grade, no longer silent Maya. She was 20 years old, a freshman at State University studying animal-assisted therapy, and she was about to address the very same auditorium that had hosted her humiliation all those years ago. Beside her stood Officer James, now with threads of silver at his temples, and Legend, whose muzzle had grayed slightly but whose amber eyes remained as intelligent and compassionate as ever. The dog was technically retired now. He spent most of his time at Officer's home, enjoying a well-deserved rest from official duties, but he'd insisted on making this appearance. Legend wouldn't miss this for anything, Officer had told her during their planning meeting. He's been part of your journey from the beginning. Maya's mother sat in the front row, her eyes already glistening with tears. Beside her sat grandmother, who'd always believed that dogs were good for the soul and had been vindicated by everything that had followed. Tommy, now 13 and considerably taller than his sister, was recording everything on his phone to share with relatives in Taiwan. Mrs. sat with a group of current teachers, many of whom had been part of the transformation that had begun with Maya's struggle. Dr. Monroe, the psychologist who'd revolutionized the school's understanding of selective mutism, sat near the back, her presence a testament to how far the conversation had come. The gymnasium was packed. Career Day at Riverside Elementary had evolved significantly over the years. It was no longer just parents sharing their jobs, but featured alumni who'd gone on to accomplish meaningful things. Maya's presence was specifically requested by Principal, who wanted current students to hear about animal-assisted therapy and about resilience. What nobody knew was that Principal had also invited a special guest to the back of the auditorium, and now juniors and sophomores in high school had driven down to support their childhood friend. They sat together in the back row, mirroring the position Maya used to occupy, watching with pride as their friend stepped into the spotlight. Principal took the microphone and delivered a brief introduction. Our next speaker is someone very special to Riverside Elementary. Maya graduated from our school 6 years ago, and I have the privilege of sharing her remarkable story with you. Maya, please come on out. Maya walked onto the stage with Officer and Legend on either side of her. The gymnasium fell silent, that same heavy silence that had preceded the laughter 5 years ago. But this time, it was a silence of anticipation rather than mockery. She looked out at the sea of faces, younger students who'd never known her silence, older students and parents who'd been part of her journey, and familiar faces of people who'd supported her along the way. I was silent, she began, her voice steady and clear, amplified through the sound system so that every person in the gymnasium could hear her. For years, I was a girl who couldn't speak in certain situations. I had something called selective mutism, an anxiety disorder that made my voice disappear whenever I felt observed or judged. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't stubbornness. It was a genuine neurological response to perceived threat. She paused, and her eyes found Legend's face. The dog looked back at her with that characteristic calm wisdom. 5 years ago, I experienced something traumatic in this very gymnasium. I was asked to speak during an assembly and I froze. When I couldn't speak, people laughed. That laughter and the shame that followed locked my silence even more firmly in place. I became Silent Maya, the broken girl who couldn't talk. That's who I was. She took a breath and her voice strengthened. Then Officer and Legend came to our school, and what happened next changed everything. Legend showed me that connection could happen without words. Officer showed me that my struggle was worthy of compassion, and gradually, week by week, I learned that I could speak. Not perfectly, not without fear, but authentically. She held up her notebook, the same color-coded research journal she'd been maintaining since middle school. This notebook contains everything I've learned about animal-assisted therapy. I've spent the last 5 years researching, volunteering, learning, and growing. I'm now a freshman at State University, pursuing a degree in animal-assisted therapy. I volunteer at the local animal shelter. I've interviewed dozens of people about how animals have helped them heal from trauma and anxiety, and I've discovered my life's purpose. The auditorium was completely silent now, not the uncomfortable silence of the assembly, but the rapt silence of people genuinely invested in hearing what came next. But here's what I want you to know, especially the young people in this audience who might be struggling with anxiety or fear or any challenge that makes you feel broken. Your struggle is not your identity. Your difficulty doesn't define your worth. And sometimes, healing comes from the most unexpected places. In my case, from a dog named Legend and a police officer who understood that compassion is more powerful than judgment. She gestured to Officer and Legend. Officer and I have been working with Principal and the school district to establish something we're calling the K9 Therapy Initiative. Starting next month, Riverside Elementary will officially have therapy dogs and trained handlers available to support students with anxiety, trauma, and other emotional challenges. We'll have multiple dogs rotating through the school, and every student will have access to these resources. The auditorium erupted in applause. Parents leaned forward with interest. Students whispered excitedly to each other. Additionally, Maya continued, my mother has founded a nonprofit organization called Quiet Voices United, providing support groups and resources for families dealing with selective mutism and anxiety disorders. We've already helped over 200 families across the state. She smiled, and it was a smile of someone who'd come full circle, who'd taken her deepest pain and transformed it into purpose. I want to talk for a moment about resilience, she said, her voice carrying a maturity that belied her 20 years. Resilience isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up, about asking for help, about allowing others to support you. It's about understanding that your struggle might be exactly the thing that qualifies you to help someone else someday. She looked directly at the camera recording the event, knowing that footage would be shared with students who couldn't attend. If you're struggling right now, if you're feeling broken or afraid or inadequate, I want you to know that you're not alone. Your struggle doesn't make you less than. It makes you brave. And there are people, and sometimes dogs, who can help you find your voice again. Officer stepped forward with Legend, and the dog looked up at Maya with absolute trust and affection. Maya placed her hand on Legend's head, and the gesture was everything. A full circle moment, an acknowledgement of the being who'd made her transformation possible. This is Legend, she said softly. 5 years ago, he put his head on my lap and showed me that I could be loved without performing, that I could be valued without speaking. That connection is possible even in silence. Every day, he continues to help countless people understand that they're not broken, they're just anxious. And anxiety, while difficult, is survivable. As Maya stepped back, the gymnasium erupted in standing ovation. Students stood first, followed by parents, then teachers. It was unanimous, overwhelming, completely different from the laughter of 5 years ago. In the back row, and were crying. In the front row was crying. In the audience, countless parents and students who'd struggled with their own anxiety recognized themselves in Maya's story and felt the first stirrings of hope. And Maya, standing on that stage with Officer and Legend beside her, realized that her silence had never been her voice stolen. It had been her voice preparing itself to speak something that needed to be said, something about resilience, about compassion, about the extraordinary healing that becomes possible when we respond to fear with understanding instead of judgment. The girl who'd been laughed at had become the woman who inspired others to laugh not at their struggles, but with the joy of discovering they could overcome them. And it had all started with a dog, a police officer, and the belief that even the most frozen voice could eventually find its way to singing.